It's at times uncomfortably brutal and brutally uncomfortable, with no clear lines drawn between those who are right and those who are wrong. Joseph Boyden's The Orenda takes us to the 17th century wilderness, where nations fight and French Jesuits colonize. Joining us now for more on this world from New Orleans, Louisiana today is Joseph Boyden, the author of The Orenda. Welcome to the agenda this summer.
Hi, how are you?
I'm really well, Joseph. We're going to talk about the book, of course, but before we get there, just take us back into mid-17th century Huronia. Paint us a picture. What was life like for First Nations people during that time?
Mid-1600s, Huronia is what we know of it now. It's also the place at Georgian Bay, basically, north of Toronto, up to the southern reaches of Georgian Bay. Beautiful, beautiful country, if you know this country. Very rich, fertile farmland. The Wendat people, or the Huron people, as we call them in English, were farmers. They were agrarians. They lived in very large villages of thousands and had been doing so for centuries. They grew the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, and did very well at this, particularly when summers behaved and there was plentiful rainfall. These were incredibly complex societies, incredibly well-structured, and as complex as any culture in the world at the time, including any European culture. And it's, this is something I wanted to show Canadians, that before we came, the Europeans came, there were complex cultures already surviving, and not just surviving, but doing very well in their own habitat.
Your book details the war between the Iroquois and the Huron. Again, it's something that most of us Canadians aren't very familiar with. So remind us, or tell us, what was the war about?
Well, this is a time when certainly the Orenda is a time of warfare, and it isn't as if the Huron and the Iroquois, the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee, had been fighting necks, throats, hands to throats for centuries or anything like that. There were running battles going on back and forth, turf wars basically, before the Europeans arrived. But when the Europeans did arrive, the French, the Dutch, and the English, the French chose the Huron as their allies, the Dutch and the English chose the Iroquois, and things escalated very rapidly into what were called the Beaver Wars. And these were wars over that the Europeans brought from home, transported over to North America, and things escalated very quickly and very violently with this introduction of the Europeans to the New World.
Oftentimes, Joseph, when the colonizer comes in, the local population bands together to take on the colonizer. Why, in this case, why didn't the Iroquois and the Huron, why didn't they band together and fight the colonizer?
Well, there was discussion between the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat to do this, exactly that. It's no secret that the Haudenosaunee were deeply, deeply distressed and perturbed by the French, and especially the Jesuits. They saw them as being probably the most evil thing that could come to their land, and so there were missions sent out to say, let's do something about this. But again, alliances had been made. And when you make alliances, you're going to make enemies as well. And this is exactly what happened. The Wendat and the Haudenosaunee were not huddling around a fire waiting for civilization to save them before the Europeans came. These were, again, complex societies. And they understood that to trade and to make alliances with one would bring certain physical comforts, to trade furs for copper kettles, et cetera, for firearms especially, was something that was looked upon as not a bad thing necessarily, a necessary evil, if anything. And so, it's not a simple history that I tried to tackle, and I was only able to tackle it really from one side of the coin, the Wendat side of things. Despite Snowfalls being a Haudenosaunee girl, I wanted to capture that as well. But it's a very complex time. Times of war always are, and these two just could not come together, come to terms with, agree on how to best deal with this new threat that had just arrived from over the sea.
And as the Europeans arrived, as you say, these were very complex, civilized societies with structures and infrastructure. Is that how the Europeans see it, or do they see it as sort of through the narrative of these are a bunch of people we can use as a proxy, and they're quote-unquote savages, and we can use them to fight our old wars?
Those from a distance looked upon the First Nations as pawns in a game, but people like Champlain understood He knew. Champlain, for example, understood the complexity of these societies. He understood that these were two nations that were at unease with one another. And whether or not he purposefully fed the flames of the fire is up for debate, I think. I think he certainly did understand that he could drive a wedge between the Huron and the Iroquois, and there was wealth in that for France. But yeah, the people who understood and worked closely with the Wendat people and the Haudenosaunee people, the Jesuits, for example, began to understand these societies are not these heathens. They are not sauvage. These are peoples that are extraordinary, and you can really see it. You know, for example, the Jesuit relations was one small aspect of my research. I researched for years, many different texts, every text I could find, and the Jesuit relations is just one small part of that. But you could watch the Jesuits, like Jean de Brébeuf, in his diaries, become a man who at first treated them as other and became almost one of them, began to understand them in a much more complex way. So anyone who had contact, any direct contact with these people, very quickly understood the layers of brilliance of these societies.
You talk about your research into this over a number of years. I'm interested because there's written history about the European aspect of this, but in terms of the Aboriginal narrative or what was going on, it's all oral history. So how did you do that research?
Well, there are historians who really pursued the First Nations side of things. The Children of Atansik is probably one of the great tomes of the Huron, of the Wendat culture over the course of centuries. Conrad Heidenreich, a brilliant man, has really gone in depth and tried to look at things from the perspective of the First Nations. Oral tradition is much more alive and well than a lot of people in Canada might understand. The stories still continue. The stories carry on about what was happening and how things came. And so part of my research is certainly Western-oriented reading, researching, note-taking, but there's a huge part of it that's far more fascinating to me, that's getting out and speaking to people. For example, Georges Siwi, the great professor, the Wendat professor at University of Ottawa, I approached him, went to him and met him and asked him, I brought him tobacco and said, George, this is what I want to do, will you help me? And he was amazing. And he's a keeper of knowledge for the Wendat people, as is his family. And so reaching out as far and wide as I could, I approached people like Alan Greer, I approached Conrad Heidenreich, I approached everyone that I could who's still alive and a major historian in the field. And they all very personably and very graciously read my manuscript and gave me extensive notes, which was quite an amazing experience. Okay,
I want to get into the characters in your book, because this is a novel, but it's told in three parts through the perspectives of three people, Snowfalls, who you mentioned, and Bird and Christophe. They are fictionalized characters, but Joseph Boyden, what historical figures inspired your characters?
Well, Christophe is obvious. I think a lot of people already know if they've read my novel or if they look at the acknowledgements in the back that he is inspired. He's not in any way based upon Jean de Brébeuf, but he's certainly inspired by the Jesuit Jean de Brébeuf, one of the Jesuits to come over from France to live with the Huron, to become expert at the language, to become expert in understanding this very complex culture, and then what the Catholics call being martyred in 1649 when the Huron finally fell to the Iroquois. And so he certainly is an inspiration for this novel. As for Bird, he's the Wendat war chief, the Wendat war bearer. He's not one specific person, or he's not inspired by one specific person, but more a kind of an understanding of this aspect of Wendat life. The idea of the war bearer. They weren't called warriors or soldiers, they were called war bearers. They bared the burden of warfare so that the others may live peacefully. So he took that upon himself, and I really wanted to explore that aspect. And then again, I didn't want to leave out the Haudenosaunee culture. I knew that I was going to be telling the story from one side of the coin, the Huron side. But Snowfalls, the young Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee captive, again is a amalgamation of a number of different people, even Kateritekik in some small ways. This idea of the young woman taken away from her family and having to be raised and try to get along in a brand new world really fascinated me.
One of the most interesting things I found in your novel is how people who are seemingly quite different and have different cultural beliefs and look, I don't know if this is the proper phrase to say, but look down on other people's cultural beliefs, come to form these alliances, these partnerships. So we see it with Christophe and Bird. How did that happen in that time?
Well, again, you know, the Jesuits left home knowing and accepting that they probably were never going to go see home again. They were never going to see the shores of France again. They were probably going to die in the New World, as they called it. And so they went with a certain, you know, there was different ways of approaching that. Some went and proselytized and looked down upon the people and never were able to look upon them as equals. But people like Brebeuf did begin to understand that these were people, these were humans who were maybe even more spiritual than the average Christian was back home. And so there were many different approaches. And I wanted, obviously, to explore. It would have been very easy to paint the Jesuit as the bad guy wearing the black hat and, you know, the twisting in his mustache.
As we've seen in many other portrayals.
Yeah, it's just too easy, you know. It's that was too easy for me. I wanted to show a person in all his complexity, and this goes for the First Nations as well. Too many novels of the time period or that deal with First Nations in any way often paint Native people as very one-dimensional or possibly even two-dimensional. But I really wanted to create complex characters who were real and were not just all good or all bad, because no one is really like that in real life. And so, you know, it was really fun to be able to show somebody who the reader should hopefully really care for do something really bad, and the reader just kind of in shock. Oh, why did you do that? Oh, I get why you did it, but oh, couldn't there have been a better way? There
are many shocks in your book. Yeah. I want to ask you about one more relationship, and that's between Snowfalls and Bird. Mm-hmm. Snowfalls is abducted, but then they develop this relationship as father and daughter. And I want you to broaden out from sort of the specifics of your novel and take me again back historically about family relations during that time. How fluid were they amongst First Nations people? There was a very
there was quite the practice of forced adoptions between tribes. Oftentimes, keep in mind too that when the Jesuits first showed up, within 15 years, a population of approximately 35,000 Wendat people had been whittled down to 10,000 due to disease, and to a much lesser degree warfare, but mostly to disease that the Europeans unwittingly brought with them. But so what was happening is these, as well as the Haudenosaunee, they suffered horribly too to disease. And so in order to strengthen their family units, to strengthen their societies, they would if they did raids, they would take women and children, and oftentimes men too, and not necessarily, it wasn't just torture everybody kind of thing. I didn't want to paint that scenario. But they would adopt these people into their tribe, into their society in order to strengthen the family unit. Of course, you know, the Huron, the Wendat people are matrilineal, as are the Haudenosaunee, and so the idea of Bird, a man adopting a young girl into his family, was virtually unheard of. But we have to keep in mind too that Bird was a powerful man in a society, and he basically could do what he wished. These societies were very much based upon the individual's wishes and how they fit in with the broader community. But yeah, Bird takes in Snowfalls and understands that it's not going to be an easy ride. He's just killed her family and taken her as basically hostage, and he knows that it's going to be a rough ride, but he understands too that time often heals most wounds, and that she might eventually swing over to his way of seeing the world. Because the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat were not all that different. They were both agrarian peoples. They were both people of the Longhouse. They lived in very similar manners. Their biggest differences were some of their religious beliefs.
And Snowfalls observes the similarities between the two nations, but yet, I mean, they're sort of trapped in this cycle of violence that they can't escape. Why can't they just get out of it?
Well, the Europeans have arrived, you know, and again, this is a novel that takes place during a time of war. This is not two cultures, the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee, in typical life together. Before the Europeans, it was not nearly this violent. There were some running battles, small battles over turf, but these were not wars where they tried to wipe each other out. But again, with the introduction of the Europeans and the making of alliances, war became inevitable, just as it did in World War I or World War II. It became inevitable and nothing could stop it by that point. And Bird realizes this as things are happening. He's like, we're almost on a river. and that river is picking up speed, and before we know it, we're going to be in the rapids, and we can't get off this river, even if we tried to. Now, at this point, it's too late. We've made our alliances, and therefore we've made our enemies, and it's going to be a battle to the last man standing kind of thing.
I'm not going to surprise you at all by asking you this question, because you've been asked it in every single interview you've done about the Orenda, and that is about the violence in the book. It's gotten a lot of attention. It is a hard book, and you've talked about it. It's a hard book to write. It's a hard book to read in terms of the violence. But I want to ask you, Joseph Boyden, why do you think that aspect, there's much more to this novel and this time, of course, why do you think it's become such a focal point of attention?
I don't know. I guess I did my job well, because if you count the actual pages, you know, and when people talk about the violence, they're talking about the torture. And there are maybe 20 pages of torture in a 500-page novel. And so I guess as a writer, I've done my job in terms of I really wanted to make it brutal and an experience that you wouldn't forget, because this was something that societies didn't forget at the time. If you watch one episode of Game of Thrones, you're going to see far more violence than happens in all of my novels. So I'm a little bit perturbed by this kind of dialogue that violence has kind of taken over this novel. This is a novel that's far more about family and about rebuilding everything after you've lost everything than it is about violence. But it was, again, a violent time period. This was a time of war. And those torture scenes were, you know, I made them brutal for a reason, because it was not a pretty practice. It was a tough practice. But we also must keep in mind, too, the Europeans were in the midst of the Spanish Inquisition at the same time. And Christophe reflects on this idea that the world is kind of in an insane place right now, where the idea of torturing each other is an acceptable practice. You
know, you make the point that it's a small part of the novel. Wab Kinew, when he defended your novel successfully at Canada Reads, was asked about this, and I thought he made an interesting point about why there's so much focus on the torture in this book. And he said that most readers are seeing it from this very, you know, Western or European bias of violence. So talk to me a little bit about that. What aren't we seeing when we see it through that lens?
Well, you know, one of the hardest things I had to wrap my head around when writing this novel was this idea of torture. Why would you torture somebody, your enemy, to such a degree? What was in it for you? What was in it for the enemy? And this was something that I really, as you know, I'm a mixed blood person, but I'm not Wendat or Haudenosaunee. I'm Ojibwe. I'm Anishinaabe. But when they did this to each other, it was a sign of respect. It was a sign of deep respect. I think at one point Wab said, if an Iroquois if a Haudenosaunee had been captured by a Wendat and wasn't tortured by him, he'd be upset because he wasn't worthy enough of this great honoring. It was an honoring, and then, you know, what the Wendat were saying, for example, when they torture a Haudenosaunee prisoner, was, "We respect you deeply, and if you don't cry out, we will respect you even more deeply, and you will live on forever through us." And again, I wanted to play down this idea of cannibalism and ritualistic cannibalism. There was some of it. It was minor, and it was just, you know, no greater a weirdness than a Catholic taking the body of Christ and putting it in his mouth. But, you know, I really wanted to understand this practice deeply, and I've begun to, and I think it's going to be a lifelong experience. But it was an idea of honoring. It was an idea of saying, you are worthy. You are so worthy that we want to take you into us. We want to, not literally, but metaphorically, bring you into us and absorb what makes you great, so that we may be greater.
The Orenda comes at a time when there's been a lot of talk about a resurgence of stories and literature that focuses on Aboriginal Canadians, told by both, you know, from non-Aboriginal perspectives as well as Aboriginal perspectives. But I want to pick up on something you said at the beginning of the conversation when we were talking about oral history, and I want to talk about literature as it sort of exists in preserving and sharing Indigenous culture. What role does literature play in that?
Well, you know, I think it plays the same role that it does in any culture. This idea that, and keep in mind, you know, these are novels. These are representations of life. These aren't meant to be taken as actual historical fact. But certainly, if a writer does his job literarily, he's going to capture something, maybe even better than a historical text can, by bringing these characters to life. And I think that's what everyone wants to, regardless of culture, is to be able to read a book and be able to say, I get it now. I understand myself a little bit better, even if these people aren't myself. I understand them a little bit better. I think one of my most proud moments as a writer of the Orenda was when this wonderful guy named Buddha Blaze, who's a Haudenosaunee, he's a DJ and he works with a tribe called Red. He came up to me and gave me a great big hug and said, I read your novel and I understand my people a little bit better. And this is a man who's a fluent speaker of Haudenosaunee, of his language. And he said, you know, now I understand a little bit who my ancestors were and where they came from and what they were doing. And that was an amazing experience for me. And I think that's any writer's kind of dream, is to have somebody from that place come to you and say, you know, you've broadened my understanding of my people. And I think that's what any culture wants from their works of literature, is a deeper understanding through creation of through making things up. You know, as a writer, I get to lie for a living. I get to make things up, but in order to tell a greater truth. And, you know, ultimately, that's what I hope my books will do.
And if this has, you know, helped people of Aboriginal descent or understand their cultures and their history
and
better.
It's also caused a lot of commotion too in Aboriginal communities in Canada.
But I also want to talk about, and I'm not trying to differentiate groups of Canadians, but I pick up on what Stephen Lewis said during Canada Reads, which was that he really hopes the Orenda rallies Canadians to Aboriginal issues. What are your thoughts on the conversation that your novel has started?
I'm obviously a little bit wigged out. You know, this is like, I'm just a writer. I'm just a lowly writer who sits for years at a time and quietly down here in New Orleans and creates these tales and visits home every month in order to fill up that well, in order to come back here and write. But I'm really, really happy that, you know, First Nations issues are getting a little bit of coverage, and not just not lip service, but a little bit more deeply than that. You know, Thomas King has just won major awards for his amazing work. Tribe Called Red just won a Juno Award for Breakthrough Artist of the Year. The list goes on and on. Wonderful, wonderful, you know, prizes for different Aboriginal people, and so people are starting to recognize Aboriginal people are not just this outliers in our society, but are actually diligent, hardworking members of the creative fabric of this country. And if the Orenda helps to open that conversation, that dialogue, fantastic. You know, I mentioned already, there's been a little bit of upheaval in some Aboriginal communities, especially in the more scholarly communities, about whether or not the Orenda is just an excuse for colonization, or if it really does paint a picture of, okay, both sides had some you know, the Iroquois and the Huron, the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat did have some say in their own demise or in their own troubles, but not nearly as much as the colonizers did, obviously. But, you know, if it causes this kind of dialogue, I think it's good. I think a novelist needs to not be afraid to do that. I've been very lucky in some ways. You know, 3 Day Road and 3 Black Spruce, unless, you know, maybe it's the world of the media and Twitter and everything now that I've just never noticed it before, but I've had a pretty smooth experience in terms of people haven't really blasted me for doing something that they disagree with until the Orenda. And so it's very interesting. You know, it is very sacred ground we're walking on here. This is ground, you know, the first contact between Europeans and First Nations, and it's a very touchy, obviously, and understandably situation for Aboriginal people, this idea of the first contact and who's to blame. And I hope no one reads my novel and says, oh, the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat are to blame for their own demise. That's not what I was saying in this novel at all. But certainly by making alliances and make a decision as a person, that decision's going to have long-term reverberations, and you know, it is starting a dialogue, and I'm fascinated and admittedly a bit frightened by it, but I think it's a good dialogue, and I think it's a dialogue that we all need to have.
It is a dialogue that's going on in this country. I'm curious, you are in Louisiana. How's the Orenda been received in America?
Good. It's just started to get its sea legs here in the States. Reviews so far have been fantastic. I've gotten some amazing blurbs from amazing people, writers I really deeply admire and respect. Things are just starting to happen nicely. You know, it's just been released. We waited almost a year till after Canada just to give it that time and that build-up. It's been doing really well in France as well, and and the UK, it's doing really well too. So it is a story that I think is a universal story. I hope it's not a Canadian-centric necessarily story. You know, Canada wasn't even a country yet when this happens. Neither was the United States. This is a kind of a universal story of a clash of cultures.
Joseph Boyden, thank you for talking about the Orenda. You'll be back with us later in the summer for our First World War coverage. We'll talk to you again. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Good to talk to you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.